Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. I have, once again, 4 pages of questions here, all sourced from the excellent ones among you who are patrons who help support Forgotten Weapons and make it happen every month. So let's dig right in. Our first question is from Perseus, who says, do you only drink Scotch or do you like something else, like vodka, rum, tequila, etc.? Well, I actually got into alcohol as a bartender and really took a liking to cocktail making, and so I drink almost everything. There are 2 things that I'm not really a big fan of. One is absinthe, simply the flavor. I'm not a big anise flavor. And the other is vodka, because this will be a little bit partisan and perhaps divisive, but vodka is pointless. Vodka is there, well, I guess not pointless. Vodka is there to make non-alcoholic things alcoholic without changing their flavor. And I would prefer to drink interesting distilled beverages that have their own unique flavor. So I don't generally stock vodka. Any cocktail worth drinking that you make with vodka should be made instead with gin. So in light of this sort of thing, I have a variety of other sorts of booze, ranging from, well, gin. Plymouth is my favorite there. There are plenty of other spirits that I like straight. Down here in the Southwest, we have access to some really fantastic tequila and mezcal. I like good rum, got a Demerara there. And then a bunch of various ingredients that go into cocktails. Everything from allspice dram, which I am almost out of, to old classics like Campari. So basically, if it's not vodka or absinthe, I'm quite happy to partake. Next up is from James, who says, I know a bit about the smorgasbord of weapons in use by the Chinese Army in 1950. During the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, U.S. Marines were apparently quite happy to augment their standard weapons with things they scavenged from the battlefield, and at least one account I've read described a semi-automatic Belgian rifle. Could this rifle have been an FN-49? If so, how would it have ended up in the hands of the PLA? It probably was an FN-49, and it was probably actually Belgian, not just Belgian made, as all the FN-49s were, but actually from a Belgian army contingent. The Belgians did have a contingent of combat troops in the Korean War, and they were there. I don't think the very first troops who went over had FN-49s, but later groups of troops who went did absolutely have FN-49s as their standard issue rifle. Now, there are a couple other possibilities. There was a very small group of troops from Luxembourg that also were in combat in Korea. They also had FN-49s, but we're talking like 2 dozen, 3 dozen guys. I mean, a really small contingent, and I don't know that any of them were KIA and would have lost their weapons. There were enough Belgians there that did take casualties that a lost and Chinese captured FN-49 is certainly a possibility. The one other long shot possibility would be Colombian. Colombia sent troops to the Korean War as well. Colombia adopted the FN-49, but this would have been like at the very end of the Korean War when the Colombians were getting their guns, and it seems unlikely that any of the Colombian troops were actually using FN-49s in Korea. So probably Belgian, and that is definitely a very plausible possibility. Next question is from Clement. It says, during World War I, Spain produced a lot of weapons copied from existing designs thanks to loose patent laws. Basically, if you didn't, you had to manufacture your thing, in this case firearm, in Spain in order to maintain patent protection on it. So if you didn't manufacture it, you couldn't take any patent protection on it. So a lot of things got copied. Some of them happen to feature some interesting changes to the original design. Do you think that looser patent laws could lead to significant improvement in existing firearms design, or would they simply reduce the diversity of designs? Honestly, I think that the patent system absolutely does increase the diversity of designs. That's like a lot of the guns that you see on Forgotten Weapons exist only because of patent laws forcing people to come up with alternative mechanisms to avoid infringing on a protected patent. The time period that patents are granted for varies depending on what country and what time frame we're talking about. To my mind, properly balanced, a patent system does not significantly reduce the quality of inventive designs. I don't think we lose anything in firearms design because of patent protections. Maybe with some exceptions to the really gray area edge case stuff of really little trivial things that are more exploitative of the patent system rather than falling within its original intended purpose. And I think that intended purpose does work. The idea of incentivizing someone to invent something unique and better by giving them a legally protected monopoly to it for a few years, I think that makes sense, and I think it works well. Next question is from James, who says, all work and no play makes Ian a dull boy. We know you're too busy to read much fiction, but in the rare moments you get to sink your teeth in, whose work do you choose? I indeed do read very little fiction. One of my very favorite authors when I do have a chance is Neil Stephenson. Cryptonomicon, Snow Crash, and many others, and I really enjoy his work. Ken says, do you think it might have been better if HMG chose to recreate the Sturmgewehr 45, the Gerät 06, instead of the STG 44? It seems like the roller-delayed blowback mechanism of the STG 45 would have been much simpler for them to get right than the more complex 44. I think demand for the rifle would be just as high, even if it still looked like the STG 44. Not a dig at HMG. He commends them for even attempting the project and hopes they still succeed. Yes, I think the project would have been a lot more likely to succeed if they had chosen the 45 to reproduce. That said, I don't necessarily share the confidence that it would be just as popular of a gun as a reproduction 44. I think the issue is the 44 has a ton of historical relevance. People see it in pictures, they know of it, it was used in famous places by well-known people. The 45 is purely an experimental design that from an intellectual standpoint is, I think, yes, very much equally, if not more interesting, but I don't know that there's quite as much of a market out there for a reproduction Sturmgewehr 45. As for it being an easier gun to make, I think it definitely would be, and that's largely because you could build the 45 based on the, hi there, sorry, I'm being interrupted by the dog, whose tail I think you can see right there. A reproduction 45 could be done on basically the mechanical grounding or work of H&K systems, where you could take an existing HK bolt carrier, bolt head, rollers, locking wedge, and all you would have to do is re-engineer that locking wedge for 8x33 Kurtz instead of 5.56, 9mm, 308, whichever system you were using as a base. With the 45, the whole gun, what HMG did was they redesigned the whole gun from scratch rather than starting with anything, with I think the sole exception of trigger packs from HKs. So yeah, it would have been a lot easier to re-engineer the roller system. No, go lie down. It would have been a lot easier to re-engineer the roller system than to build the whole thing from the ground up. Sean says, you said that the FG42 is one of the most controllable, full automatic, full-size rifles, and it seems to achieve this, at least in part, by having a spring in the stock to help with recoil. Why is this seemingly simple measure not more widespread? Does it contribute to the FG's fragility, which, as far as I know, is its only significant drawback? The more I experiment with FGs, and especially being able to go back and look at the high-speed footage from the original one that I was able to shoot, I'm not actually convinced that that stock buffer does all that much. Maybe it does, but there's not a lot of energy left getting dumped into the stock by the time the bolt carrier comes that far back. I think the advantages, the controllability to the FG come largely from its muzzle device, from its inline design, which is, that's a lot of why the AR-15 or AR-10 before it were as controllable as they are. And yeah, those two factors, I think, have more to do with it than the recoil buffer in the buttstock. Now, the reason why I think people haven't really worked on trying to replicate this sort of controllability is that it generally went away right about the time that the FG42 was being developed. We see a whole generation of 7.62 NATO caliber rifles, but in a select fire role, they're not really meant to be fired from the shoulder. And Even the FG is not hugely effective fired from the shoulder. Yes, it's more controllable than others, but you're still better off firing in semi-auto from the shoulder and saving the full auto for basically duplicating a light machine gun, firing the thing from the bipod. And that's how most of the other rifles that followed of this pattern, things like the G3 and the FAL, those are intended to be used in full auto from bipods, which they generally had integrated into the gun, and otherwise only in the most extreme emergency circumstances. So there's not a lot of impetus for designers to try and come up with a 308 or 7.62 NATO rifle that is easily controlled in full auto from the shoulder, because that's not a goal that really many agencies or potential customers are looking for. You know, no matter how controllable it is, it's still not going to be all that accurate. If you're dumping the magazines of a rifle like that in full auto, really makes a lot more sense to do it from the bipod. Alex says, I remember my grandfather telling me how he had a Finnish submachine gun as a part of the Danish Resistance. Do you have any knowledge of what that might have been? It was probably a Suomi. Suomi submachine guns kind of got all over Scandinavia and the Nordic countries. They were actually produced under license outside of Finland. They were produced by the Swedes, they were produced by the Swiss, and they were actually produced by the Danes. The Danes manufactured the Suomi with a few little minor changes, pretty, design changes to the stock and front sight, that sort of thing. Designated at the model 1941, and they made something like 1,400 of them, which were generally confiscated by the German army, but they were there. So it was almost certainly a Suomi that your grandfather had, but it could have been a Finnish one, it could have been a Swedish one, it could have been a Danish one, probably not a Swiss one, but Denmark did buy a very small number of standard Finnish Suomis before they started their own production line as well. So Darth Raiden says, how do collectors afford World War II related machine guns? For example, the MP40 is thousands to tens of thousands if you want a decent example. In your experience, have collectors just saved up enough for such an expense, or are there other ways to attain guns that are so far up the scale of cost? I've heard of collecting groups that pool their money to go in together to buy something, but I'm not really sure how great an idea that is in the long run. I actually hadn't been familiar with collecting groups, although that does make sense. It's an interesting idea, and I think with a trust or corporation, I can see how that could work. Legally, I would tend to agree that that's maybe not the most sustainable long-term solution. That seems ripe for arguments about who gets to have what when, and I don't know. Like, half of the point of collecting it is to have it, so collecting it without actually having it because someone else has it. Anyway, it's an interesting idea. It's not one that I've seen a lot of. In my experience, most of the machine gun buyers let's start by separating out people who inherited machine guns. Because a couple decades ago, 40, 50 years ago, machine guns were substantially less expensive as a relative thing than they are today. Yeah, they were still pricey, but there wasn't as much interest or demand in them. And they were harder to get your hands on without the internet, knowing who has what, how to find them. I have some interviews with John Keane, actually, where we talk about some of these issues. But so there are a lot of people, a substantial number of people out there whose fathers or grandfathers owned machine guns and they have inherited those guns. So we'll leave them out because they didn't have to come up with the money to get the guns. As for people who are buying them, what I've found is they tend to fall into like upper, middle, and higher income levels. They are people who are, who have high positions at companies, or often self-employed entrepreneurs, people who started their own business and developed it into a very profitable enterprise, who are then able to they have a substantial amount of income at their disposal that they can use on something like a machine gun. In particular, because a machine gun is a durable asset, it's not the sort of thing that is going to, you don't, if you spend the money and then you decide you want the money back, you can get the money back out of a machine gun. You might make some money, you might lose a little money depending on how wise of a purchase you made, but it doesn't go away. It's not a consumable good. And it's not something like a car that has a significant upkeep expense if you want to maintain its value. You can buy a machine gun, put it in a closet, pull it out in 10 years, and as long as there's not a water leak in your closet, no big difference. So What I run into are people who can afford to say, yeah, I think I'm going to spend $15,000 or $20,000 on that MP40, maybe this year. Some of them maybe this month. And those are the people who tend to accumulate machine gun collections. There are certainly people who save up the money to buy one particular machine gun that they really want. I think that's more feasible than a lot of people recognize. You know, if you want to save up for a year or two for something that is in the $5,000 to $10,000 range, if you want a basic machine gun, which can be anything from, you know, a Mac 11, a Sten gun, you know, a simple submachine gun like that, to some of the weirder and more esoteric light machine guns in particular, Hotchkiss portatives, Chauchats, even something like a Breda 30, if you're willing to put up with it. That's a mechanically and historically really cool and still relevant gun that's, as machine guns go, on the relatively affordable end of the scale. It's a little early in the day for me to be drinking booze. We'll stick to just tea for now. All right, next question is from George, who says, if France hadn't fallen so early in World War II, given that they were often on the forefront of small arms development, do you think they would have developed an intermediate cartridge or assault rifle like the Soviets and Germans did? No, I actually don't think they would have. There was a little bit of experimentation at the end of World War I with basically 351 Winchester turned into an FMJ cartridge. The US tinkered with that in the form of the Burton. The French had a Ribérol experimental sort of machine carbine thing that used it, but that didn't really stick around as a focus of their development. When you look at what the French were doing in the 20s and 30s, it was all centered around the 7.5 by 54 model 1929 rifle cartridge, which is 7.62 NATO minus like 5%. They developed that cartridge to get away from 8 Lebel. They wanted a modern, bottleneck, straight wall, rimless rifle case that would be easily adaptable to box magazines. That's exactly what they got. They developed the Châtellerault light machine gun for it. And after that, it was a process of developing all the supplemental arms to support it. So I haven't seen any really substantial developmental effort put into an intermediate cartridge. And I think part of the reason for this is not necessarily that the intermediate cartridge was the obvious best thing, and thus anyone who didn't do it was, failing in foresight. I think part of it is a logistical question of, do you want to have your riflemen and your machine guns using the same ammunition, or are you willing to accept the logistical burden of supplying 2 different cartridges? Because what the Germans did with 8 Kurz is supply 2 separate cartridges, and it caused them problems. They had more trouble supplying ammunition for a long time than they did supplying Sturmgewehrs. So if you're going to give the rifleman a short cartridge, you're not going to run your medium and light machine guns in something like 8 Kurz, or let's call it hypothetical 7.5 Court. You're going to still have the full-length cartridge for the machine guns. And the French attitude appears to have been that wasn't worthwhile. They would rather stick with 1 cartridge. And that probably comes from experience in World War I, where they had the option of trying to fit in extra cartridges, which could have had some real benefits at the time, and they opted not to, and to stick with just 8 Lebel for everything across the board. This is largely why the French didn't use the Lewis gun, or it's one reason the French didn't use the Lewis gun is couldn't build it in 8 Lebel, or it wasn't being built in 8 Lebel. So the only place the French used the Lewis was as an aircraft gun, where the logistical supplies were unrelated to the infantry, and they only had to get a pretty limited amount of ammo to airfields. Anyway, long way to say, no, they were not working on an intermediate cartridge rifle in the late 30s, and so even if they hadn't signed the armistice with Germany towards the beginning of the war, I don't think we would have seen any intermediate development from the French. Jonathan says, greetings from MCAS Futenma, Okinawa. At which point in time did the U.S. military, in your opinion, have the greatest superiority in infantry small arms over her enemies? And how about the worst disadvantage in the same way? Well, my thought is the greatest advantage that the U.S. military has ever had is probably going to be World War II. And that's not necessarily, that's an arguable point. I pick that because of the infantryman's rifle specifically. The M1 Garand was a fundamental step forward over bolt-action rifles of all stripes, even the best bolt-action rifle, the Kar98K. And when you add that up with the sidearms, the handguns that were in use, which are basically irrelevant from a military standpoint, and the Luger, the P38, and the 1911 are all effectively interchangeable in that way, and submachine guns where, yeah, I think the Thompson was too heavy, but I think the MP40 had some of its own issues, and they kind of balance out. The M1 Garand is massively better than the Kar98K and contributes to substantially increased firepower from the individual American rifleman compared to the German. And then the place where this gets potentially arguable is the machine guns, because the German machine guns were in many ways better than the American machine guns. The Browning 1919 was a heavy and kind of clumsy gun, and the MG34 and the MG42 were superior to it in almost every way. As for the time when the US had the greatest disadvantage against its enemies, I think that's pretty clearly World War I. And we had such an incredible disadvantage in machine guns that we basically didn't have machine guns. And that's why we ended up buying and borrowing them from the French. Is the US had like a couple hundred machine guns, period, in the entire inventory. And those were split between 4 different models, none of which were like sufficiently useful to even bother bringing over to Europe to fight. So the US went into World War I with pistols and bolt-action rifles, no submachine gun, although, to be fair, neither did anybody else. We didn't have mortars. Other people, we didn't have machine guns in any sort of significant enough quantity to use them as a viable tool. We didn't have light machine guns. We had the 1909 Benet Mercier, which was a pretty iffy gun to begin with, and we didn't have nearly enough of them. We had the 1904 Maxim, which was the heaviest Maxim, I believe, of any militarily adopted Maxim. That thing was an absolute boat anchor. And again, we didn't have enough of them to do anything useful with. So we ended up buying Hotchkiss 1914s from the French. We had no light machine guns until the very end of the war. Like, we didn't even have enough rifles to equip the army that we ended up sending to Europe, which is why we ended up having like 2 1917 Winchesters, 1917 Enfields, for every Springfield under U.S. service. The British contracted with American companies to build the 1914 Enfield, and those companies, seeing the American Army's desperate need for more guns, said, hey, we've got this already in production here. We can swap it up for 30-06 pretty easily, and then how about you just buy those from us? And the U.S. need for guns was so great that they just took them. It helped that they were as good or better than Springfield's. But I don't think there's been another war that the U.S. went into where they were nearly that overmatched in terms of small arms. If you look at, even if you want to look at like the Indian Wars, the U.S. may not have had the best tactical choice in guns with single-shot trapdoors, but they had enough of them. They had ammunition for them. World War I think, is the worst drubbing that U.S. small arms have taken. Let's see. Next up, Stelios says, I have heard the MG42 being referred to as the best machine gun in World War II. Now, I generally don't hold much of characterizations of the best of anything, much less guns, but I was under the impression the MG42 was one of the more decent guns for its category and time. Yes, it definitely was. Recently, I heard a completely different view of it as an over-engineered gun with way too high of a rate of fire, and the need for frequent barrel change is cumbersome, and so on. I would love to hear your view on this. P.S. I have limited experience shooting the Rheinmetall MG3 derivative of the MG42 with the Greek army, and was rather impressed. So, the Germans had two. Let me start with, I think the place that the Germans had the biggest initial fundamental advantage in machine guns in World War II was doctrinal. They went into World War II with the idea of a universal machine gun. We want a gun that will act as both light and heavy gun. And that's something that the other powers didn't do. You look at the Brits. They had a Bren gun for the light, and they had a Vickers gun for the heavy. The Americans, we had like well, we had the BAR as the light going into World War II, and we were still using 1917 water-cooled Brownings for heavy machine guns. And then also M250s, but that's not really, I mean, that's sort of a different scale. But again, we had a light and a heavy. It was primarily the Germans who had the thought to combine these into a single gun. That gun is man-portable. It can be fired by one dude or, ideally a crew of 2 as a light gun and 4 as a heavy gun. And it was easily interchangeable throughout a variety of roles. It could be a vehicular gun. It could be an aircraft-mounted gun. It could be a tank-mounted gun. It could be, you put it on a Lafette mount, which is this fantastically, incredibly expensive and overcomplicated, but very capable, adjustable long-range heavy machine gun mount, or you just drop it on the bipod that's on the gun all the time anyway. But removable if you want to take it off because you don't need it. In my opinion, the MG34 is the better of the two. It's better than the MG42. And in part, that's because it has a lower rate of fire. The very high rate of fire of the 42 was definitely a liability. And that was addressed even during the war with heavier bolts to reduce the rate of fire. And the MG3 after the war absolutely did the same thing, reduced the rate of fire because it was a little ridiculous as originally designed. Now, as for the gun being overcomplicated, frequent barrel changes, put that in perspective. The US guns, you couldn't do a barrel change. Being able to do one, kind of a nice thing, and you can do them pretty quickly and efficiently on the 42. Not that hard to do them on the 34 either. So yes, I would say if you have to come up with a general purpose machine gun, a universal machine gun in World War II, the MG34 and the MG42 both are going to be in the top echelon of the best guns designed to fit that role. Daniel says, was the SKS really a good idea for the Russians to adopt at the end of World War II? It seems they already had a decent battle rifle for the day in the SVT, and with the upcoming AK series, it wasn't really necessary to adopt a mid-range cartridge. Was it really necessary to adopt a mid-range cartridge semi-auto rifle, especially with the seemingly obvious downfalls as battle rifle? I haven't shot an SVT, but which is better, SKS or SVT? I tell you what, if it was me in 1945, I would pick the SKS. I think the intermediate cartridge was absolutely a good idea. Now, at the time, what the Soviet Union was looking to do was adapt a complete new family of small arms using this new short 7.62 by 39 millimeter cartridge. And the concept they had was they wanted a submachine gun, a rifle, and a light machine gun, all using this intermediate cartridge. And then, as we just talked about a few moments ago, they made the decision that it was worthwhile to supply 2 separate cartridges. So your basic infantry squad's going to be using the short cartridge, but you still have heavy machine gunners using things like Maxim guns with 7.62 by 54 rimmed. So the SKS has a place in this initial system as the replacement for the SVT. It's a shorter rifle, it's a lighter rifle, it's a lighter recoiling rifle. It doesn't have some of the magazine compatibility issues that they had with the SVT. Making 100% completely interchangeable cheap disposable magazines is a difficult mechanical engineering process that they didn't quite pull off during World War II. Using an SKS with stripper clips avoids all of those problems. The US got to avoid all of those problems with the M1 by basically doing the same thing, by using an end block clip that would be effectively used once and thrown away. And hey, if there's something wrong with that clip, chuck it, use a different one. Much easier to deal with on an industrial scale than magazines. Now, the really understandable question that comes up is why the SKS and the AK? The SKS really kind of looks pointless when you put it side by side with the AK. What can it do that the AK can't? Well, the reality of the situation is the Russians didn't fully appreciate that when they introduced both of these guns. The intention was that the AK would replace the Papashas, the PPS-43 submachine guns. And it would be for mechanized troops and paratroops and the people who would normally be getting submachine guns. And that's why they wanted a larger magazine and fully automatic capability, because it was filling the role of a submachine gun. The SKS was just intended to fill the role of the SVT or the Mosin as a rifle. Thus, the rifle wasn't full auto, the SKS didn't need to be full auto. What they discovered once they got these guns into a lot of field use is you know what, the AK basically can do everything the SKS can do, plus extra things, and so the SKS really is sort of obsolescent. It's irrelevant. We don't need it. And that's why the SKS had a very short service life with the Soviet military. It would go to China, where they didn't get the AK design for quite a bit longer. China made much more use of the SKS as a result. So that's why they had the SKS. Interestingly, like you comment on, or reading between the lines here, you're asking about the, like, what about the benefits of having a larger cartridge in the 54 rimmed? Well, with a standard infantry rifle, it turns out that's just not really all that relevant, or at least it wasn't at the time. However, the Russians did decide that it was relevant for a precision marksman / sniper's rifle, a designated marksman's rifle. And that's why they ended up introducing the Dragunov in 7.62 by 54 to give it that heavier cartridge for that specific role. All right, moving on, our next question is from Captain Coconut, who says, what is your opinion of the magazine-fed semi-auto shotguns? I've seen a lot advertised recently. I wonder if... Captain Coconut has very poor spelling and grammar and punctuation here. I wonder if they're any good. Keep in mind they're made in China, and the listings say they must be broken in with high brass shells. So I think what he's getting at are, there have been a bunch of really, really, really cheap semi-auto shotguns coming in from China with all sorts of different brand names on them. And I've seen a bunch of these on places like Centerfire Systems. And they're like $199.99 for a semi-auto shotgun, and it comes with 2 3-round magazines, and they're also selling 5-round mags. These are box mag fed guns, and I'll be honest, they keep piquing my curiosity. Like, I'm really curious if those things actually work, because what I'm assuming is they can't possibly actually work. I've come very close to just buying 1 or 2 of a couple different patterns just to try them out and see how terrible they are. But then I sit back and I think about it a little bit. I'm like, okay, so I could spend like $500 or $1,000 on shotguns that I am quite convinced are going to be completely worthless. I don't know that I really want to go through that and then be stuck with having them afterwards. So maybe I still will at some point. I'll tell you what, let me know in the comments. Do you think that's something worth doing, worth spending channel resources on and spending time on? Or should I just hand that off to Carl and have him suggest that he try that out at InRange? Let me know. Next up is Ed, who says, you've done several videos on the Japanese attempts before and during World War II to make a semi-auto rifle, including their take on the M1 Garand. What I'm wondering is, considering the amount of military technology exchange that took place between Japan and Germany, do you know if Japan had any contact and interest in the Sturmgewehr 44 or its predecessors? I would have thought they'd recognize it as an almost perfect weapon or concept for their requirements. I think it indeed would have been an excellent conceptual weapon for the Japanese military. As far as I've been able to tell, there was no actual technological exchange. I haven't found any reference to Japanese interest in the Sturmgewehr, attempts to get that design. There was technological exchange between Japan and Germany, particularly related to things like aircraft and armored vehicles. The history of Japanese development of semi-auto rifles, what I've covered on video has mostly been the pre-war stuff. There was both an Army and a Navy program during World War II to try and develop semi-auto rifles. The Army program came first, 1941 to 42 or so, and it ultimately was scrapped when they decided that even if they could get something designed and reliable and working, semi-automatic rifles were going to be too expensive, and they didn't have the industrial infrastructure to build them in sufficient quantity. It would have been great on the battlefield, but it wasn't a practical thing for them to be able to produce at that point. Now, the Navy picked up interest in 43, and the Japanese Army and Navy were armies and navies are always rival agencies, but in this case, they did some of their own weapons procurement too, and they had perhaps more of a rivalry than in other nations. The Japanese Navy was particularly interested in having a semi-automatic rifle for its paratroopers. And that's what led to the development of the Type 4 or Type 5, which is the copy of the M1. But it took the Japanese Navy a long time to get that working. So it was late 44 by the time they had prototypes basically ready. This used standard 7.7 millimeter ammunition. The idea of Japan being able to not just develop tool up and produce a semi-automatic rifle, but also a new cartridge at the same time. I think that would definitely have been several bridges too far for their industrial infrastructure at the time. So maybe there was some interest, between specific technical officers who were talking, but it never appeared to be recognized as a practical possibility. All right, battery change there. Our next question is from Michael, who says, what are the benefits to having a CNR license? Could you explain it for all us non-American viewers? Well, actually, I think there's a benefit to explaining it for American viewers as well. The CNR stands for Curio and Relic. It is a subtype of federal firearms license in the United States. So in general, a federal firearms license is what you get if you want to be a gun store. And there are 10 or 12 different versions of them for kind of standard gun store, for pawnbroker, for someone who manufactures ammunition, for someone who is an importer of guns, for someone who is a manufacturer of regular guns, someone who is a manufacturer of machine guns, someone who is a manufacturer or an importer of destructive devices, all these different categories. Type 3, a 03 type federal firearms license, is a collector of curios and relics. So under United States law, if a firearm moves between states, it can only go to a licensed federal firearms dealer. So if you are just a regular unlicensed person who wants to buy a cool collectible gun from someone in a different state, what you do is you arrange to buy it, you send them the money, you send them the license of a gun dealer in your state. They then mail the gun to that dealer, you go to that dealer, you fill out a background check form, undergo a background check, and then you can take possession of the gun. What a curio and relic license allows you to do is bypass a couple steps, or rather make more efficient a couple steps of this process. So a curio and relic license allows you to purchase directly interstate firearms that are considered curios and relics, which is any gun that is 50 years old, or specific other guns that are recognized as particularly valuable for their collectible status. ATF actually has an entire PDF, it's like a 100-page PDF list of guns that are recognized as curio and relic eligible. So what you do when you send in that license, it's basically they're preemptively doing the background check on you rather than have you go through it every time you want to get a gun. So go through the background check, they send you your license, and then when you're going through this purchasing process, instead of sending the seller a copy of your local dealer's license, you send them a copy of your curio and relic license. They can send the gun directly to you. You are then required to maintain a logbook of guns that you have purchased with the license, or guns that you own. It is actually technically guns that you own that are curio and relic eligible. You can also sell guns interstate the same way, although anyone can ship guns to a dealer in another state. Anyway, you maintain a logbook of guns that come in, guns that go out. This license is specifically intended for collectors. So the law says you are not allowed to use this license to engage in the business of buying and selling guns. But it's a little bit vague on exactly what that means. So are you legally allowed to make any money on gun sales? Well, yes. But if they decide to audit your books at some point and decide that, you have purchased 85 guns and you have resold 83 of them, they're probably going to look at that and decide you're running a business and forfeit your license. Anyway, exactly what things, like, are you allowed to make any money on any gun sale ever? That stuff gets into a big old rabbit hole of people arguing over technicalities of the law that aren't actually written and so are thus always up to interpretation. But that in a nutshell is the CNR license. Guns over 50 years old, you can receive directly in the mail. This license costs $30 for a 3-year license. When the license expires, you don't have to give up any guns that you've got. Your logbook is mailed into ATF, and that's it if you don't renew the license. The practical upshot of getting a CNR license is that it's ridiculously expensive because you will end up spending all of your money on curio and relic eligible guns because they become so easily convenient to buy. You just send the shop your credit card and poof, the gun appears in the mail. It's wonderful and very, very dangerous to your bank account. Let's see, next up is Matt, who says, I was rewatching one of your videos on the FG42 and noticed the bayonet is the French flip-over style. In fact, I had a chance to look at a very, very early FG, serial number 15. The bayonet on that gun is actually a modified MOS-36 bayonet, and that gun sat in the Rheinmetall factory collection until like the 70s. So that's the original bayonet that it was made with. They originally actually just cut down French bayonets for the FG-42. Anyway, Matt asks, is this vulnerable to the good idea fairy in the same way as the MOS-36? Which is to say, in the MOS-36, you've got two little spring releases, one for when the bayonet's stowed and one for when it's deployed. If you stow the bayonet and then click another rifle onto the bayonet, you are then screwed because you have no way to access the little release to get the gun off. With the FG-42, that is not an issue because the front end of the bayonet is not actually covered. So when the bayonet's clicked into place, stowed, you can still access both ends of the release latch. So no, you do not have that same issue. Evan says, why wasn't the Pom-Pom Maxim used more in World War I? As an aside, why weren't grenade launching machine guns developed in World War I, especially ones based off the Pom-Pom? I couldn't imagine a better replaces weapon for that conflict. So the Pom-Pom is basically the Maxim gun scaled up to 37 millimeter, firing at about 350 rounds a minute, and firing 1-pounder, generally exploding shells. The problem with it from a World War I perspective is that it is very heavy. We're talking, it's like 1,200 pounds, I think, for a typical Pom-Pom. And they were designed for naval use primarily, and that's where they excel, where you bolt the thing down, and thus you don't have to worry about the recoil. And you don't really have to worry about it being exposed because it's on a ship. So if you don't want it to be in danger, you sail the ship somewhere else. When you take one of those and put it onto a World War I battlefield, you've got a gun that is bulky and hard to move and stands out a lot. People will notice that thing, and it will immediately come under fire from indirect artillery. It's going to be an absolute artillery shell magnet. And it's a direct fire only gun. So unlike something like a trench mortar, you can't really use it to lob shells up over hills or into defilades and that sort of thing. And and they're tremendously expensive on top of it. So I think the issues with the Pom-Pom in World War I were largely that it was well enough designed for naval warfare that it just was not well adapted to land warfare. And at that point, you could get the job done with a variety of other weapons for a lot less expense and a lot less risk. You know, how hard is it to manufacture a battery of a half a dozen small trench mortars that can pretty much do the same job as a Pom-Pom for a tiny fraction of the cost? And now you've got 6 trench mortars that one guy can pick up, or 2 guys can pick up and move around very easily. That 1,200-pound Pom-Pom is more like having the infrastructure and the weight and the expense and the risk of a full-fledged artillery piece, but it's only 37 millimeter and it's only direct fire. So they did see use as anti-aircraft guns, but that was pretty much it in World War I. As for grenade launching machine guns, I think if such a thing had been developed, it would have been very popular. I think the time frame and the technology at that point was, the time frame was too short and the technology wasn't well developed enough to do it in a way that would get you something that was more portable and more practical than a Pom-Pom. Let's see, next up, Lee. Lee says, I'm interested in how you go about getting permission to do videos of weapons in collections, museums, and now governments, with the most recent French internal affairs videos. Do you specifically ask sometimes about specific weapons? Thanks for the content, etc. Thank you. Almost always my work with really, whether it's private collectors or museums or government agencies, it's always pretty much coming from a specific personal contact to begin with. I very rarely reach out to a museum, like go to the museum website, find the contact page, and write them an unexpected email. Hey, I'm some dude. I'd like to come look at the guns. I haven't had very good luck with that. Instead, what tends to happen is I will develop a correspondence with someone who either works at the institution or knows someone who does, or often, frankly, these days, often I will get emails from a person who says, hey, I'm the assistant curator at the so-and-so museum, And we've got some cool stuff, and it'd be really great if you wanted to come do some video. In fact, that's how the French thing worked. And then work from there. So usually, most of the time, it then requires 2 actual visits to get video done, because you kind of have to go once to find out what guns do they have, what condition are they in, what are the filming locations like. You know, a lot of these places they're not designed to be film studios. I don't think I've ever filmed in a place that was actually intended to be a film studio. So it can actually be difficult sometimes to find a place that has decent light. I don't require really good lighting, but something decent, with a backdrop that isn't something, you know, a backdrop that's acceptably public. A lot of places, you know, they're a little leery of what sort of stuff is visible in the background of the videos. Noise is the big one. A lot of people don't recognize how long it really has to be quiet in a room for me to get any appreciable amount of filming done. So anyway, you go once, visit the place, and get a feel for, okay, I could film over there. You know, this place is bustling at lunchtime and there's a ton of noise, but after lunch, everyone goes away and does this thing, and we can film over there. Here's the backdrop. Here's a good place I can put a table, grab a chair, that sort of basic procedural stuff. And then you go back a second time with a day or 2 or 5 planned out. Now they know what I need, I know what's available to me, and then we can have a very good filming session. So that's pretty much it. Return visits are always the nicest. When I have collectors or organizations that like me and enjoy having me in to do work, the second, third, fourth time in a place is always a lot more efficient and productive than the first, because all those issues are worked out. Next question is from Walker, who says, to what degree do you think that the reputation of a firearm is misconstrued due to personal preference or national pride? In basic training, I had a drill sergeant who was originally from England, and at one point during weapons familiarization training stated, quote, the L85 rifle system is more reliable than an AK. God bless the Brits. The Brits are the worst at this. It does absolutely happen in general, especially with countries that have like a required national service, where there are going to be a lot of people whose only real experience to military firearms is with the military firearm that they are provided and instructed on by their own military. It's obvious and understandable that that firearm is going to be presented to them as a really good firearm. Like, this is what we are going to provide you for the defense of our country and your home, should such be necessary. It's great, you should have confidence in it, etc., etc. It's some of the more, the armies that have more of a volunteer force, that tend to have more people in them who are perhaps shooters in their own right and have a wider experience with firearms, who have a little more objective view of different guns. In my experience, it is the British more than anyone else who have a really skewed view of their own service rifle. And I think it's largely because the British military establishment really went to some pains to justify the L85, especially early on, trying to tamp down rumors that it was in fact a really terrible gun, by doing things like emphasizing its accuracy. That's one of the big ones I see, is British soldiers who have experience with basically nothing except the L85, pointing out that it is in fact one of the very most accurate service rifles ever, and not really paying attention to anything else because you don't need to worry about the other stuff. It's a great rifle. But yeah, every once in a while, a Brit who's really gung-ho about the British military will pop up and talk up how the L85 is the greatest gun ever, and they're completely wrong. And I don't try to correct them, because eventually either it doesn't matter, or they will get more experience on their own with other guns, and they will realize, in fact, truly the only way that they can change their mind is to fire other guns and begin to recognize that, in fact, the L85 is a terrible, terrible waste of British taxpayer money. It's actually fine now. Like the A3 and even the A2, in fact, was fine. The A3 is fine. It's a perfectly good gun. It's still a little heavier than it needs to be, and it's got some shortcomings, like it can only be fired right-handed. But it's a far, far cry from the original A1 pattern rifle that was dangerously bad. Next up is Lewis, who says, what is the most interesting forgotten ammunition you've ever come across? I've read some fascinating stories on an ammo board about Nazi 9mm poison bullets. I've seen a number of interesting types, self-contained ammo, like silent telescoping ammo, where when the gunpowder fires off, it expands a piston and throws a bullet forward, but it's actually all, the gas is all contained in a pressure vessel that never ruptures, so there's no sound. That's cool stuff. Some of the caseless stuff is cool, Trowns. However, by far the most notable that I've ever run across was in South Africa, where I visited a pretty substantial ammunition collection, and the guy had cyanide poison bullets. And I remember them very distinctly because they were in a sealed little plexiglass case with a big old warning sticker on it. And I'll be honest, I didn't have a lot of time there, and I didn't ask him a lot of detail about it, and I don't remember what he told me at this point. But yeah, it was, honest to goodness, cyanide poison bullets. No thanks. I'll pass. Adam says, have you looked at the K&M M17S? It features a number of elements that you and Carl have held up as desirable in bullpups, and Ken McAllister, the KM in K&M, happens to be located in Arizona. I'll be honest, I really haven't. I've given it a peremptory glance once or twice. I actually had an M17 during the assault weapons ban. Like back when I was in college, I had an M17, which didn't learn anything about it at the time compared to what I would, I'd be a much more discerning judge of that rifle today than I was back then. But the reasons that I haven't really looked at the M17S are it doesn't offer anything novel internally. It's an AR-18 inside, just like the M17 was. It is only right-handed. It's got a fixed ejection port, which in a way is a good thing. That avoids all the weird complexity that is often the downfall of bullpups that try to be ambidextrous. You get unusual systems, and sometimes they work, like the F2000, and sometimes they mostly work, like the Desert Tech MDR, or work with a little bit of finesse and iteration. The RDB, the RFB, like the source of problems in these guns is virtually always the weird ambidextrous ejection system. So if you just leave that out and stick with it just ejects out the side, don't put your cheek next to that side, you solve a lot of problems. The SA-80 does that, the FAMAS does that, the M17 does that, but I'm left-handed. And so unless the rifle is going to offer a substantial benefit to justify me having to shoot it right-handed, I'm not hugely, I'm not going to go out of my way to really jump on it. So the M17, to my mind, doesn't. In general, I don't think the bullpup format provides anything that's really substantive, unless you're in this situation of like, oh, I am actually going to jump out of helicopters on a regular basis, and I need a compact rifle, and I need to have a full-length barrel to get full ballistic potential out of the cartridges. So for all of those reasons, I'm not saying the M17 is bad, it just doesn't do anything that I'm looking for. Tanner says, would you be in favor of the US government restarting the Springfield Armory or some new form of government-funded firearms design research group? I'll be honest, I would be. I think the Springfield Armory program was a good idea. And the purpose of Springfield Armory was, to some extent, to do R&D and develop new guns. But what it was also there to do was basically to do that initial industrial, iterative, over-the-hump sort of work, where when you go from a hand-tooled prototype to a production line mass-manufactured gun, there's a lot of work in between, and it's hard to do. There are a lot of mistakes that get made. There are a lot of problems that result. Even if your handmade prototype is perfect, you have to make a lot of changes to things like tolerances, clearances, exact design parameters to make it easily manufacturable. And the purpose of the US Arsenal system was to do that work and to basically build, to design the tooling to mass produce a gun so that it would be available to private industry if the US government ever needed it in large numbers. So the idea was Springfield Armory develops the production line for the M1 Garand. They figure out, here's how we can make it on mass production tooling. But we don't need mass production. We're going to make a few tens of thousands. However, if, say, World War II breaks out and we need to make 6 million M1s, and we need to recruit Winchester and Remington and other companies to do this work for us, instead of them all independently trying to come up with this tooling and inevitably resulting in parts that are only interchangeable within one manufacturer's guns, instead, the Springfield Armory can say, here is your production line package for the M1 Garand. Boom, build these tools, these jigs, here's your inspection technique, here's your gauges, done. We can sidestep all of that tooling up process. I think that's the biggest advantage that the Armory provided, and I think it's one worth paying for. It was shut down because basically McNamara and the Defense Department decided that this was an expense that wasn't really necessary, that this job could be done by private industry without having to maintain a government arsenal system to do it. Now, I think there are also definite advantages that one can have with a government arsenal, who are people basically, I think, considering how much money the US government spends on all manner of things, the idea that we could have a research and development bureau whose job is to tinker with stuff and find newer, better improvements in military equipment without having to have, without the danger of, like, if it turns out that this project doesn't work or we can't sell it on the commercial market, then this division of Acme Gun Co. goes bankrupt and you all get fired. I think that stifles the creativity of the people working in that division. Now, you don't want that for everything, but to my mind, as something in the form of a Springfield arsenal, yeah, I think that would be a worthwhile expense for the US government to maintain. Next up is Andy. Says, I've noticed in several of the museum locations you film, Royal Armouries, etc., you say that they are not open to the general public. Why do these places choose to be largely unavailable when public interest is key to maintaining their existence? I think we've got a little bit of a misunderstanding. There are these places, the places that I go where the guns I'm looking at are in basically reserve vaults, are there because generally these institutions have two facilities. They have a public facility. Like the Royal Armouries has a giant 5-story museum with all sorts of stuff in it that is completely open to the public, in fact, free to the public. The Cody Firearms Museum has a tremendous, fantastic firearms museum open to the public. Not free, but available to everyone all the time. The problem is every organization like that, every gun museum or collection is going to have a lot more guns than they can actually physically fit in a display. And they have to do something with the rest. In the case of the Royal Armouries, they also have a mission to support British military, British law enforcement, and a lot of other governmental organizations. You know, this started off as the pattern room. Like, this is where the government stored its specific manufacturing models for the guns that it was going to contract, for issue to the British military. It became a depot for R&D. Like, we're thinking about developing this. We want to look at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, for example. We want to develop this, and we want to look at what other people have tried. So we go to the pattern room, the Royal Gun Collection, and look at what do they have? What have other people tried? And so in that way, the collections they don't have to be public to serve their legitimate interests. And the other big issue is they can't handle the public. And that's because these guns aren't behind glass. You have a balance of accessibility and security. And if you're going to let the general public in and have hundreds, if not thousands of people every day walking past guns, unfortunately, they have to be secured in some way that you can be sure that someone isn't going to steal the magazine, someone isn't going to steal the whole gun, but little parts. Someone's not going to accidentally grab it and knock it on the floor and break something. This is the dilemma of museums, is the more you want to preserve it, the less you're able to let people touch it. So with the Royal Armouries, the National Firearms Center section, they have guns that are just in open racks. I would say like a gun store, except way more convenient to get to because there aren't any counters or little barricades in front of them. It's just open racks of available guns. Grab whatever it is that you're interested in. And so they have to watch people who are in there, and they don't have a ton of staff, and it's just not physically conducive to open access to the public. So as a way to balance their missions, they have to limit that to, they have to limit the number of people who can come in. So that's why they do it that way. Luke says, do we know why the French never deleted the witness holes from the sides of the Chauchat magazine? From my understanding of the production process, they could have been obviating a fairly significant step, probably would have freed up production time. Did they somehow not realize how bad an idea the holes were, or am I missing something? The more that I shoot my Chauchat, the more I realize, and Othais pointed this out as well, you almost have to have those holes to be able to load the magazine, to be honest. Because it is such a, it's a full half circle of a magazine, it's really hard to push, you can't just like push cartridges in down the top like you would with a typical box magazine. You really, after you put a couple rounds in, you have to grab the follower and pull it around the curve of the magazine and then feed cartridges in. And the thought of trying to reload those magazines if they didn't have the witness holes would actually be really difficult. And I can kind of see why they left it that way. You'd have to come up with some alternative solution, because French Chauchat fire teams carried a slew of magazines, but they also carried a lot of ammunition in packets. And they did, on a very regular basis, reload magazines that they already had. And so those mags had to be reloadable in a relatively easy manner. It's hard enough as it is. Doing it without those witness holes, like, that would be tricky. And so I think, honestly, I think what they did is they accepted that this is a compromise. It's maybe not the best compromise. Had they done things a little differently during the design phase of the magazine, but that was a done deal. It was in production, and the sacrifice that would be involved in shutting down Chauchat production for a substantial period of time to redesign the gun around a better magazine, or even just to shut down magazine production to try and come up with some better balanced solution, that would be worse than just dealing with the malfunctions and having a continuously flowing supply of Chauchat automatic rifles going to the front. 3 more questions here. Next up is from Brandon. Said, was there any simplification on US small arms aside from the Thompson, like the Axis powers did with their last-ditch designs? In submachine guns, yes. So you mentioned the Thompson. The Thompson went through 2. It went from the 1928 A1 to the M1, and then to the M1A1. Substantial simplification from the 28 to the M1, and then even the M1 to the M1A1 was another significant simplification. Like, they got rid of the whole floating firing pin system and just went to a plain fixed firing pin. The grease gun did the same thing. The original grease gun had a charging handle on the side. They got rid of that, and they went to just mill a thumb cutout in the side of the bolt and just go with it. Beyond that, no, the US really didn't. And the reason that we didn't is we didn't have to. There was no substantial pressure on US industry aside from wanting to make more, where Germany and Japan were both faced with regular bombing raids destroying their factories and the raw material supplies. So if the Germans and the Japanese wanted to maintain a steady supply of arms, they had to simplify them. They had to, in fact, in particular, do things like diversify production facilities. You need to have small parts made by a variety of small distributed shops to make the whole process a little less vulnerable to bombing. The US never had to deal with any of that. We could have giant industrial complexes building all manner of war material, and we never had to worry that, oh, there's going to be a fleet of Luftwaffe bombers, and if they can hit the whole complex, we're totally screwed. So, no, the Garand never really substantially changed. You know, they iterated little elements to improve reliability and manufacturability, but the Browning machine guns, the M1s, the 1911s, really no substantial changes. Nicholas says, you've mentioned your wife several times. Just curious, did you meet her before or after Forgotten Weapons was a success? And what does she think of your unique career choice? I met her well before Forgotten Weapons was a success. And in fact, it is largely because of her that it became a success. So there came a time when of course, when I started this, it was a blog that I did in my spare time before work, after work. And I got to a point where you're at that point, and I think this happens with every jump from employment to self-employment of, I don't really have enough business or enough income to be able to fully support myself, but I can't get enough unless I can dedicate more time to the endeavor, and I can't dedicate more time to the endeavor as long as I still have this full-time job. And when I got to that point, she offered to take on all of the household expenses. She was working a regular career sort of job. And so she did that, which left me free to dump all of my time into Forgotten Weapons, and that's what allowed me to build it into an actual viable full-time occupation. So what does she think of it? I think she's fairly happy with it. She's not really into guns. I mean, her gun collection is larger than probably that of 99.9% of Europeans, but that's not a high bar to clear. So yeah, she appreciates it, she enjoys it. It's not her own passion though. And our last question is William. I have been listening to old Q&As to fill time at work. Coincidentally, on the day you and Carl announced the What Would Stoner Do 2020 project, I was listening to you answering the question of if you could only have 3 guns, to which you allude to the What Would Stoner Do you were building at the time. The other 2 were the Hudson 9, which you hadn't shot at that point but only handled at SHOT Show, and the PKM. With what has now happened with Hudson, but also having shot the Hudson, as well as having had the chance to shoot the constant recoil systems of the Ultimax and the Knight's light assault machine gun, would your choices remain the same? That is a very interesting question. The What Would Stoner Do carbine? Yeah, that would absolutely stay the same. The machine gun and the pistol are an interesting one though, because for example, the Knight's light assault machine gun in 7.62, I would prefer over the PKM, with a caveat that part of the reason that I had the guns on that list are on that list because they are thoroughly well proven out guns. You know, the M16 platform has been under development for more than 50 or 60 years now. The PKM has been under development and under improvement for 50 or 60 years now. The Knight's gun hasn't. So if it lives up to my experiences with it, which was a relatively limited one, then absolutely, I would completely rather have that than a PKM. It's lighter, it's more controllable, it's a better gun. But you don't necessarily know if that's going to happen. And the same thing holds for the Hudson. With Hudson now completely out of business, there's not any long-term parts and support available for those guns, and there won't be any further iteration on them. It's not going to be like Glock, where Glock was introduced in the 80s. Shoot, that thing's been around for 30 or 40 years now, being iterated, and that's why the current Glock is such a bulletproof sort of gun. It's because it's had that experience that went into it. Hudson isn't going to have that, so Hudson probably isn't the gun that I would choose, even if my experiences with them in the limited scope have been quite good. To my mind, it's more valuable to have the long-term development behind the gun. So when it comes to handguns, I don't really have a clear winner to me. I'd kind of probably pick Glock, like a Glock 19, just by default. It's been around, they're very good. It's not the best gun in a number of ways, but as an overall complete package that I can just pick it up and I just don't have to worry about it. I know how it'll shoot, I know where it'll shoot, I know that it will shoot reliably. It just works. But there are a lot of other handguns that fit that same description. So frankly, with handgun, I'd be content with almost anything as long as you hit kind of a basic bar of reliability and service history. So that, I believe, is all of our questions for Q&A number 37. Holy cow, I've done 37 of these now. If you'd like to get your question into the next month's Q&A, sign up to help support the channel on Patreon. When I'm getting ready to film a Q&A, I post a request for questions over there, and that's everybody at the $2 a month level and higher. So a big thanks to all of you guys for submitting questions. Hopefully you enjoyed watching the video. We'll be back with another Q&A next month.